When German forces surged across the Soviet frontier in June 1941, the Red Army faced near annihilation. Yet, against all odds, they not only repelled the German invasion, but eventually stormed Berlin, securing victory. But what if things had played out differently? The Soviets had been secretly planning their own offensive set for early July 1941. So what would it have meant for World War II if they had actually invaded Germany first? How would the tides of World War II have shifted? And would it have actually been a good thing? Let's find out. First, it's important to review the preparations the Soviet Union made and whether their planned invasion, codenamed Operation Groza or Thunderstorm, was truly a realistic option. While there's actually a mountain of evidence to suggest that the Soviets were actually planning to invade Eastern Europe first, perhaps one of the biggest questions that remains is how their security zone was dismantled just weeks before the war started. The thinking of the time was that defenders should have what's called a security zone along their border. The exact parameters of what constituted a security zone are subjective, but the basic premise is to have around a 50-kilometer territory from the border devoid of any major military equipment like depots and stores, smaller bridges, weaker roads, and mobile light infantry units. Behind that was supposed to be a complex defense network of fortified bunkers, gun emplacements, railway lines, roads, bridges, and other infrastructure needed to provide a robust defense. In the years before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the USSR, the Soviets had been diligently building their security zone and defense network, colloquially called the Stalin Line. At the frontier, the Soviet security zone was left bare of almost anything useful. Huge mine belts were laid to destroy enemy armor and funnel German troops into ambushes. Russian sappers had rigged bridges for demolition. Railway troops were prepared to destroy track and rolling stock. And the Soviets created an extensive network of professional partisans whose jobs it was to harass and delay advancing Germans with sniper attacks, ambushes, and cutting off communication and supplies. The Soviets spent years training a dedicated cadre of partisans who could raise small armies if the situation warranted. They buried a vast amount of weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and communication equipment for this purpose. As for the Stalin Line, it was an impressive array of mutually supporting machine guns, artillery, and trench emplacements supported by thousands of tanks, planes, and reserve troops that could be swiftly moved to crisis areas of the front. So, with all of these defensive measures, why was the German blitzkrieg not ground to a halt at the border? In the several months leading up to the war, the Soviets actually had dismantled most of their security zone and the Stalin Line. While there are many theories as to why this was done, one of the best arguments was that dismantling all these defensive measures, some of which had taken over 10 years to build, would get in the way of advancing armies. If the Soviets had been planning to attack, the security zone would have been in their rear and unnecessary. Lastly, the weapons and supplies that comprised these defensive networks would be needed in an assault on Eastern Europe. But perhaps the oddest part is the timing of these events. From May to September 1939, the Red Army fought a decisive battle against the Japanese in Mongolia. In the aftermath of the battle, known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, where Soviet forces under future Marshal Zhukov won a stunning victory in the first-ever combined arms battle, Stalin appointed Zhukov to lead his efforts in fortifying the Soviet frontier. And what he did does not lend itself to thinking it was defensive measures. In addition to this, in November 1939, the Soviets invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. During this conflict, the Finnish security zone, which was about 40 to 60 kilometers, held up the Red Army for 25 days and was a primary factor in the huge casualties they suffered. By the summer of 1941, the Soviets knew the importance of a robust security zone. If Stalin truly did not want war because his army was not ready, as many historians have claimed, why then would he purposely destroy the one thing that could buy his military time in the event of an attack? When Zhukov took over preparations for the border areas, he did the opposite of planning for defense. In Ukraine and Belarus, he found that the roads were in disrepair, bridges could not support tanks or artillery, and there were not enough large air bases. While one's first instinct might be to say this was bad, these conditions were all inside the security zone, where the Soviets would want the invaders to face poor infrastructure conditions. Instead, Zhukov did the opposite. He summoned railway troops to build more and more tracks that ran east to west. He built dozens of air bases, all within 10 to 30 kilometers of the border. He built larger bridges that could support heavy tanks and repaired roads from rapid movement. But what was the purpose of all this construction work? According to leading historian and former Soviet intelligence officer Viktor Suvorov, These preparations were because of lessons learned by Zhukov during the battle for Khalkhin Gol. During this battle, the distances, supplies, and materials had to travel were immense, with some equipment arriving from more than 8,000 kilometers away. Combined with poor roads and almost zero infrastructure in the last several hundred kilometers of the supply chain, Soviet forces heavily relied on trucks and horse-drawn carts to get supplies, equipment, and troops to the front. According to Suvorov, Stalin did not want to repeat this mistake and had Zhukov nearly double the number of railways, bridges, roadways, and air bases in the area. And the purpose of all of this? Well, none other than transporting large armies from east to west, which is exactly what Soviet planners were doing in the several months leading up to the war. By June 22nd, the Red Army had assembled a massive force on its frontier. Over 190 personnel divisions were assembled within the security zone along the border. These divisions numbered just under 3.3 million personnel, including roughly 2.7 million Red Army soldiers, 215,000 sailors, and 153,000 NKVD security troops. These forces were well armed. In total, the forces had over 57,000 artillery pieces and mortars, over 11,000 serviceable tanks, and almost 7,600 working aircraft. But all of these troops were dangerously exposed. All along the front, major bridges across rivers like the Bug formed natural defense barriers. While the Red Army had previously rigged these for demolition in the past, these explosives were removed on the eve of battle. While some historians suggest this was just a measure of goodwill between Stalin and Hitler, people like Suvorov suggest it was to ensure the bridges were safe to cross for an attack. This, supported by the large numbers of pontoon bridges, railway ties, and rolling stock pre-positioned near major bridges on the Soviet side, was indicative of an impending Soviet attack. But while the Soviet generals remarked after the war that the planned invasion of Germany was slated to start July 6, 1941, what would have happened if the USSR had attacked before Germany did, June 22nd? At nearly 2,800 kilometers long, the amount of territory that the Germans had to defend and from which the Soviets could attack was massive. With such huge distances at hand, both the Germans and the Soviets knew that despite the immense sizes of both armies, they could not put all their proverbial eggs into one basket. Instead, they had to decide where to attack, and geography was a major factor in this. Known as the Pole's Eye, the swampland that stretches from Poland and Belarus through northern Ukraine is a natural barrier for defense. This terrain makes it incredibly difficult to conduct the kind of high-speed maneuver warfare necessary in modern conflict. Knowing this, the Soviets needed to test whether they could choose their main thrust in the north toward Berlin or in the south toward Romania. To figure this out, the Soviets carried out two high-level war games in Moscow between December 31, 1940 and January 11, 1941. These games were attended by some of the absolute cream of the crop in the Red Army at the time. More than 50 generals, admirals, and staff officers attended the games, so secret were they in nature that Soviet authorities transported each officer in his own plane or car from their duty stations. While gone, Soviet officials continued press releases about the daily activities of these officers so their absence would not be noted publicly. Once at their hotel, they were kept under armed guard and bussed in together in the morning and back in the afternoon at the conclusion of each day's events. Total secrecy was needed for an event that would decide how Stalin would proceed in the event of war. During the first game, the Soviets had the following parameters. Germany invaded first on July 15, 1941, that they got 70 kilometers inside the USSR before being thrown back. And the Soviets launched a counterattack on August 1, 1941. While it's not agreed upon or cared how the Soviets pushed the Germans back to the border, what mattered was the counterstrike. During the game, the eastern grouping of forces led to a decisive victory over the Germans, albeit after very heavy casualties in the north. During the second war game, the Russians attacked first. This time, General Zhukov led the Soviet forces and decided to make the main effort in the south towards Romania. During this war game, the Red Army easily pushed aside scattered German and Romanian formations due to the lack of natural obstacles and the superior equipment compared to what existed in Romania at the time. After taking over Romania, his armies could advance into Central Europe toward Budapest. These events would force Germany to move troops and equipment south, where the Soviets' vast superiority in numbers could overwhelm the remaining defenders. But why was Romania considered such a strategic target? Inside Romania was a vast quantity of easily extractable oil, known as the Ploiesti oil fields. Though numbers varied throughout the war, on average the Ploiesti oil fields provided about a third of all Axis oil needs until Romania left the Axis side in 1944, Taking over Romania would be a strategic failure for Hitler that would have very real impacts on the battlefield for the German military. Because of this, the Games concluded that making a southern approach to seize Romania would be the best move. Once Romania had fallen, the Soviets could pivot northward to finish off German formations in Poland and East Prussia. Then they could drive on Berlin itself. So when would an invasion have happened and what would it have looked like? It's time for 0 Hour. As far as determining when the Soviet military was alleged to have been preparing to go on the offensive, the date of Sunday, July 6th is thrown around a lot. The reason for this, besides testimony from several Soviet generals, is grounded in fact. By July 10th, the redeployment of more than 200,000 Soviet troops from 5 interior military districts would have been completed. In addition to this, huge quantities of material, including tanks and ammunition, would have reached the front line in time for dispersion to ground troops. But why July 6th specifically? According to Suvorov, being a staunch atheist, Stalin always liked to conduct big operations on Sunday when he figured he would catch people off guard. That's a fair enough assessment, and combined with the math that Soviet forces would have been ready by July 10th, which was just 5 days before the expected German invasion of July 15th in the War Games, the Soviets would have been planning to strike by then. But there is a problem. This date is for the alleged Soviet timetable. Developments on the frontier would have forced Stalin to take action sooner. In the months leading up to the German invasion, German aircraft and ships violated Soviet airspace and waters hundreds of times. Some of these reconnaissance flights penetrated more than 200 kilometers into Soviet territory before being forced back. In addition to German military violations, there were increasing numbers of attempted German agents caught at the border. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, no fewer than 36 German agents were killed by Soviet border guards. These agents' jobs had been to sow discontent and confusion in the ranks of Soviet troops at the border. And if that wasn't enough, Soviet intelligence received damning warnings from both confidential sources inside the German military and Winston Churchill himself that a German attack was imminent. While the real-life Stalin did not believe these reports, as he was perpetually suspicious of all information, let's assume, for the sake of argument, he believed these reports and decided to strike when it became clear Germany was moving the bulk of its panzer armies to the front. What then was the state of the German army at this time? From February 1941 to June 1941, the German military moved more than 100 divisions eastward. By May 21st, the Germans had moved 42 infantry and 1 armored division to the frontier. Between May 22nd and June 10th, the Germans moved a staggering 20 infantry, 14 armored, 13 mechanized, and 9 security divisions to the front. On June 10th, the infantry divisions began marching toward the Soviet border, and on June 18th, the armored formations began moving as well. All told, the Axis army possessed over 3.3 million soldiers at the front, 3,277 planes, 4,445 tanks, 3,769 artillery pieces, and more than 36,000 anti-tank guns and mortars. These troops were organized into 3 army groups, called the Army Groups North, Center, and South. These army groups had a combined total of 121 German divisions, 15.5 Romanian divisions, 16 Finnish divisions, and half of 1 Slovak division. With such a huge number of forces stacked against him, the Soviets would face near parity in manpower at the front. With Stalin's permission, the Politburo would likely have waited until all the German forces were moving toward the border to catch the enemy off guard. This clear hostile intent would have signaled it was time to act, and the Soviets could have launched their own attack, probably a week before the Germans, as the mass infantry began moving toward the border. But what would that chaotic first day look like? In the early morning hours of Sunday, June 15, 1941, Stalin orders his army to conduct the unthinkable, begin Operation Thunderstorm, and boy did they start with a bang. All across the front, from the Leningrad district to Odessa on the Black Sea, tens of thousands of guns opened fire, in a crescendo never before seen in the annals of warfare. Artillery of all calibers fire continuously into German positions, depots, and storage facilities all across the front. As this is going on, thousands of Red Army bombers with fighter escorts take off from their bases across the Western Military District. Though the planes encounter some scattered anti-aircraft fire from some sleepy gunners, they begin to unleash a hail of bombs onto German airfields that had been only recently finished and with little protection against attack. Though many German planes try to take off in the dead of night, most are shot to pieces before they even have a chance to taxi on the runways. Despite this surprise attack, German planes from further afield in Poland and Hungary begin taking off to join in what would become the largest aerial battle in human history. As Red Army planes and artillery continued their attacks, Soviet infantry mentally prepared for the massive battle that was about to take place. After being issued their vodka ration to calm their nerves, they sat and listened as political commissars spouted speeches about the need to kill fascism once and for all. Commissars assured the troops that though they were going on the attack, they were really doing it for defensive purposes, just as Stalin had told a group of army officers at the military academy graduations just a month before. But despite waiting for the bombardment to subside, the Red Army has already started sending people across the border. After spending years training professional saboteurs, they begin assembling at their designated muster locations and pass out weapons, ammunition, radios, explosives, and money. Once all the equipment's been passed out, this professional cadre of partisans begins knocking on local village doors to get people out of bed and ready to go. Once everyone's been woken up, squads of partisans begin to march to village squares. From here, they ride in trucks that'll take them to the border, where they'll form platoons and companies of saboteurs, each with their own purpose. One platoon is to blow up this depot, another a barracks, and a third a radio tower. All across the Eastern Front, thousands of squads of partisans begin pouring across the border to attack pre-arranged targets. But these aren't the only troops on the move. In the lead-up to the war, Soviet Army commanders made a huge commitment to training a large number of paratroopers and glider infantry. As part of an effort to raise a 1 million-man paratrooper army, the Soviets erected jump towers all across the Soviet Union. To even qualify to jump off the tower and then a plane, young men needed to prove themselves physically, pass several shooting tests, and have high grades in school. Only then could they be permitted to jump out of Soviet military aircraft. And these recruitment efforts worked. By the spring of 1941, the Red Army recruitment efforts had trained enough men to establish 5 airborne corps, which was 10 divisions worth of airborne infantry. This was more than double the Germans had at the time, considering that not only did the Luftwaffe only have 5 divisions, but these had been decimated at Crete the month before and had not yet been reconstituted. In addition to the 5 airborne corps, the Red Army possessed hundreds of gliders, with more than 30,000 glider pilots in training in 1940. The Red Army envisioned mass armies of glider infantry, which they ordered 7,500 more on June 16th. These 5 airborne corps are preparing to board their aircraft at the bases. As these troops are ready for battle, they check equipment and prepare to conduct what would become the largest air assault in the history of warfare, with 3 airborne corps in the north, 1 facing Romania, and a 5th in Crimea. The Red Army is going to be dropping tens of thousands of paratroopers soon. But that's not the only unit heading out this morning. Across ports all across the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, dozens of Soviet submarines receive orders to get underway. Their orders are simple and merely state they should conduct unrestricted submarine warfare. These submarines, of which Stalin has built dozens over the past decade, are to conduct 2 missions. Firstly, they were to sink any military or merchant vessel that could aid the German war effort. Secondly, they are to disrupt any efforts by the Germans to conduct an amphibious landing in the Baltics to keep the Soviet rear areas secure. As the submarines get underway toward Germany, more people are mobilized throughout the Soviet Union. Because Stavka anticipates heavy casualties, the 2nd Strategic Echelon is being fully mobilized. The 2nd Strategic Echelon consists mostly of reservists and conscripts who have been mobilized to fill in gaps for the 1st Strategic Echelon as they cross the border. However, Stalin had a plan to mobilize 5 million more men into the army to ensure that he maintained a manpower advantage over the Germans and their allies. This is because the Axis coalition has assembled 75% of their armies on the Soviet frontier. While Stalin still had several million men on his other borders, he needed millions more to replace casualties and keep up the momentum of the 1st Strategic Echelon. With that, Soviet men all across the USSR are heralded out of bed this morning. Those who local Communist Party members do not wake up find armed NKVD troops at their workplaces. Soviet men are given no time to say goodbye to their families or sort out their affairs. They're directed to sign their muster rolls and shepherded to local train stations in their civilian clothes to Army recruit depots for outfitting. While all this is happening throughout the country, the several-hour artillery bombardment stops. With an eerie silence across the front, the Red Army goes on the attack. With a loud "Oorah" war cry and officer whistles, several million men rise as one and begin pouring across the border. Here's what this would look like on each front. As the Soviet 9th Army streams across the Romanian border, it has the advantage. On the eve of the battle, the Germans and Romanians mustered 1.5 million men, 16,008 guns and mortars, 1,144 tanks, and 1,829 planes. This force is pitted against the 9th Shock Army and 18th Mountain Army, which contain a combined 1.4 million men, 26,580 guns, 8,069 tanks, and 4,696 planes. The disparity in tanks and the quality of the troops here will be crucial in the coming battle. With a nearly 7-to-1 advantage in tanks, the Soviets here are actually more mechanized than their German and Romanian enemies. While the majority of the Soviet tank forces of the BT class of tanks, these are still just as powerful and in some regards better than their German Panzer I and II counterparts, with smaller engines and less powerful armaments. However, with the Germans sporting hundreds of vaunted Panzer IIIs and IVs, they can easily take on the BT tanks head-on. The resulting battles are a massacre for those BT tanks that find themselves on the wrong end of a Panzer IV. But the Soviets had something the Germans were not expecting. Fresh off the factory floor and made under the strictest secrecy, the Soviets unleashed hundreds of T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks. Contrary to popular belief, the Soviet tank force was capable and much larger than the German commanders had expected. In fact, Hitler even remarked later that had he known the Soviets had as many tanks as they did, he would have invaded in the first place. As these heavy tanks rumble into battle, German tankers are stunned. They never expected to see such a massive tank. And they were right, the Soviets were the first country to create the concept of a heavy tank. KV-1 and KV-2 tanks knock out dozens of German tanks and armored vehicles. They take shot after shot from Panzer IVs with their 75mm rounds just bouncing off their armor. The only defense German and Romanian troops have is preparing carefully orchestrated ambushes that blast these tanks point blank with artillery fire. But they don't get much of an opportunity since they are currently being outflanked. In the north, the Carpathian Mountains stretch across Romania, Slovakia, southern Poland, and Central Europe. Over the past several months, the Soviets have secretly moved the 18th Mountain Army into position here. The 18th Mountain Army is the best mountain warfare unit in the whole Red Army. Comprised almost entirely of Armenians, Azeris, Georgians, and Chechens from the Caucasus Mountains, these troops have spent their entire lives living and fighting in the mountains. As the 18th Mountain Army begins its assault into the Carpathians, it brushes away light Romanian resistance. Not expecting an attack, the Romanians had left few forces here. With its left flank exposed, the Army Group South must decide whether to fall back or stay put and risk being encircled. Too prideful to fall back, the Germans stay put and hope their still arriving troops for Operation Barbarossa will now relieve them, but the Soviets have other ideas. In Crimea, the 9th Special Rifle Corps has embarked transport ships from the Black Sea Fleet. Their destination is the Romanian port of Constanta. This port is vital to the export of Romanian oil via the Black Sea. Capturing it will help cripple Romania's ability to ship oil out of the country. As the Black Sea Fleet steams toward the Romanian coast, the 62 ships of the Danube Naval Flotilla are wreaking havoc among German and Romanian positions, and they're threatening to cut off the line of retreat for those units near the border. Sailing under a hail of coastal artillery and ground fire, the ships of the Danube Flotilla decimate enemy positions and drop off companies of Soviet Marines at ports all along the Danube. The capture of these ports behind enemy lines further confuses the enemy about where to go or what to do. And it's only getting worse. In the air, the Soviet 3rd Airborne Corps begins dropping into Romania. Their goal is to seize bridges and towns across the Danube to prevent those units that had yet to fully detrain from reaching the front. While these pivotal battles play out, another larger battle is going on in the air. As German and Romanian troops fight for their lives to avoid being encircled, thousands of Soviet aircraft blanket the sky and block out the sun. The 4th Long-Range Bomber Corps bombers fly overhead, not paying any attention to large troop formations and other targets near the border. Where are they going? The Germans soon find out. Just like in the war games in January, the bombers make a beeline for the Ploiesti oil fields and their refineries. But this is still not a walk in the park. The oil fields at Ploiesti have one of the densest air defenses in all of Europe, with more than 52 flak batteries, 15 radar stations, and more than 10 squadrons of aircraft protecting them. The oil fields are actually the 4th most heavily defended areas in Europe outside Berlin, Vienna, and the Ruhr Valley. Though Soviet bombers take horrendous casualties, their bombs find their mark. With the oil fields and refineries burning by the end of the first day, German fuel production is cut down by a third. And to add insult to injury, the planes of the Soviet Navy's 63rd Air Brigade, based out of Crimea, continue ground attacks that destroy all the pipelines leading from Ploiesti to Constanta, crippling Romanian oil production even if the Soviet forces withdraw. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had advanced dozens of kilometers into Romania, cut off Axis escape routes through the Carpathians, seized control of the Danube, wrecked the Ploiesti oil fields, and were blocking reinforcements from getting to Axis troops trapped near the border. But how are things going further north? In the Baltics, German Army Group North is comprised of just over 787,000 troops, 8,348 guns and mortars, 830 aircraft, and 679 tanks. In Army Group Center, the Germans and their allies have amassed 1.45 million men, 15,161 guns and mortars, 2,156 tanks, and 1,712 planes. On the Soviet side of the border, Stalin has gathered just under 1.2 million soldiers, around 5,300 tanks, nearly 24,000 guns and mortars, and almost 4,000 aircraft. And if one was following the math here, the Soviets are actually outnumbered almost 2-to-1 in terms of manpower, since they've shuffled most of their forces to the south for a decisive blow against Romania. But thanks to having surprise on their side, the Soviets decide to press onward with their attack. According to pre-war Soviet plans, the following tasks would have been assigned to each of the assembled armies. The Soviet 8th and 11th Armies on the Northwestern Front, numbering some 23 divisions, were primarily assigned a defensive role. Their main job was to secure the coastlines of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, to repel any seaborne invasion attempt and secure the borders to repulse inevitable German counterattacks. However, they were assigned limited offensive operations to seize the northeastern part of Poland, including Suwałki, Sejna, and Rachki villages. The purpose of this was to shorten the front line to secure the right flank of the Western Front. Once this had been achieved, the Northwestern Front would begin a gradual advance toward the German town of Insterburg in concert with the Western Front. As for the Western Front, comprised of the 3rd, 4th, 10th, and 13th Armies numbering some 42 divisions, their main task was less clear than the Northwestern Front's goal. While the Western Front was to leave some troops behind to secure the border area around Minsk, probably the 13th Army, the 3rd, 10th, and 4th Armies would begin a general advance into East Prussia. However, due to the strength of the German defenses in the area, they were not actually expected to seize any major territory. Instead, their purpose was to primarily fix the Germans in place for the main effort further south. The Soviet Southwestern Front was the largest of the three fronts, composed of the 5th, 6th, 26th, 12th, 18th, and 9th Armies, numbering some 96 divisions. As previously noted, the 18th and 9th Armies were currently invading Romania. This is because the Carpathian Mountains form a natural divide in this front, so even though the 18th and 9th Armies are under the nominal control of the Southwestern Front, their offensives are not mutually supporting like in the north. The primary purpose of the remaining Soviet armies not engaged in Romania was to defeat the Lublin-Sandomierz grouping of German forces and advance to the Vistula River. Once this had been reached, the armies were to swing north, toward the Kielce, Piotrków, and Krakow direction, seize the area of Kielce and Piotrków, and halt at the banks of the Oder River. After reaching this objective, the Southwestern Front, with its flank secured by the 12th Mountain Army in the Polish Carpathians, would link up with the Northwestern and Western Fronts for an all-out assault on East Prussia. While this might have been all good on paper, the plan assumes one critical thing, that the Soviet troops could break through quickly in the Lublin direction. In southern Poland, the Germans had assembled some of their highest concentrations of men and material as part of Army Group Center, which outnumbered the Southwestern Front almost 2-to-1. A lightning-fast breakthrough here could only be possible if a few conditions were met. Firstly, the Soviets must have destroyed the bulk of the Luftwaffe on the ground. Second, with most German armor still stored at depots near major railheads, Soviet troops would need to advance very quickly in the first 72 hours to capture large numbers of German armor and armored vehicles. Otherwise, German forces would have the means to escape encirclement and stall Soviet attacks long enough for more reinforcements to arrive. However, assuming that the Soviet forces inflicted similar losses on the German military, this could have been possible. During the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans destroyed 4,990 Soviet aircraft at a loss of just 179 German aircraft. If the Soviets achieved a similar victory during their invasion, this figure would actually mean the destruction of every German aircraft assembled for Barbarossa and then some. In fact, with 4,878 planes in the entire Luftwaffe at the time, the entire German Luftwaffe would have ceased to exist in 1 week of fighting. But these figures get worse. During the first few days of the German invasion, the Soviet Western and Southwestern Front lost more than 3,300 tanks, 1,800 artillery pieces, and 324,000 men captured. If these fronts inflicted similar losses on the Germans, all of the armor assembled by both Army Group North and Center would have been destroyed. As for casualties, during the quarter from June 1941 to September, the Red Army suffered over 2.8 million casualties, including almost 400,000 dead, 665,000 wounded, and 1.7 million captured. If faced with similar losses, the Germans would have lost about 75% of the invasion force assembled for Barbarossa within 3 months, with just 1 million men left to defend against the Soviet onslaught. If Hitler had suffered such catastrophic losses, what would have happened then? In the event that the Soviets attacked first and achieved successes similar to the Germans, the aftermath would have been shocking. With no Luftwaffe, almost no armor, and just over half the entire German military killed, wounded, or captured within 3 months, Hitler would be scrambling to stabilize the front. At first, he would direct all territories occupied by Germany to send all available troops to the Eastern Front and leave local auxiliary forces to keep German affairs in check. In addition to this, Hitler would demand that Italy provide the bulk of its 1.63 million man army to send eastward. However, doing so would basically mean abandoning North Africa, losing Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia to be governed by local troops, and having Sicily vulnerable to attack. Mussolini would certainly protest this, but Hitler would force him to do so as the senior partner. With millions of Axis troops being divested from other parts of Europe to blunt the Soviet advance, the Western Allies could have launched their own offensive operations into Fortress Europe much earlier. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, could have happened as early as 1941, and D-Day could have gone down in 1942. As for the state of the Eastern Front, Hitler would have certainly been able to slow the Soviet advance, at least by throwing millions of remaining German, Italian, Hungarian, Romanian, and Finnish troops at the problem. However, with no air force and limited armor, the Germans would find themselves where they were in 1944 and 5, several years earlier. So while the Germans would certainly be on the back foot, they could still put up a good fight, but this would not be for long. With the loss of Romania in 1941 versus 1944, the German economy was not prepared for the loss of 30% of its oil, as both German industry and the military would grind to a halt. The Wehrmacht would abandon its blitzkrieg tactics in favor of static warfare, but this was all predicated upon keeping their allies for as long as they did. In real life, Italy dropped out in 1943, Finland in 1944, and Bulgaria in 1944. It's quite possible that, with such a turn of events on the Eastern Front, all of Hitler's allies could have abandoned him much sooner. If this was the case, Soviet forces could have been there 3 years earlier in the spring of 1942, instead of storming the Reichstag in April 1945, since it took them 3 years to push Germany back to the Soviet frontier of 1941. With the war potentially ending in 1942, tens of millions of lives could have been saved, since the death camps had not been set up yet. Stalingrad would have never been fought, and so many other events would have simply never happened. But alas, the Germans struck first, so Operation Groza and all it could have done for the world will never be known. Now check out this. What if Hitler never invaded Russia? Or this other video instead?